So I did a tutorial on scanning black and white negatives with Vuescan. This tutorial is going to be basically a redo of that tutorial because Vuescan's interface has changed quite a bit in the years since I made my original tutorial. Most of the settings I used in the old one are still valid with the current versions of Vuescan, but I've had people who are confused by the locations of the different controls because some of the stuff has changed in how Vuescan is laid out. And so this is the current version of Vuescan, version 9.8.14, which just came out today, August 8th, it was August 7th, 2023 is when it came out. So this is the current version as of right now. I've already got the negative stuck into the scanner, so let's go through all the different options here and see what we need to choose. We're going to start with the input tab, and the first thing is the options mode is professional. We want that to be that's what we want that to be, professional. The task is scan to file. The source, this is going to be which scanner you're using. If you have more than one scanner attached to your computer and turned on, you'll be able to choose from a list of scanners which one you want to use. Mine says LS-50 as the source because that's the only scanner that I have connected right now. It's a Nikon LS-50, which is also known as the Coolscan V. The media that we're going to scan, you can choose from image, slide film, color negative, or black and white negative. We're going to choose black and white negative. Preview area, leave to auto. Bits per pixel, this needs to be 16-bit gray. There are some people on the internet who claim that you should scan your black and white pictures in RGB mode. RGB stands for red, blue, green. It's for color scanning. There is no advantage to scanning a black and white negative in RGB mode. All that does is get you a file that's 3 times as large. It brings you no benefit as far as the tonality or anything else. I know there's people who claim that an RGB scan gives you more tonal values or better tonal range. That's not true. All you're getting by scanning an RGB is a bigger file. So we're going to choose 16-bit gray. Now, you don't want to choose 8-bit gray. An 8-bit file really does have fewer tonal divisions than a 16-bit file. And so you do want to choose the 16-bit one. The next thing we're going to do is make gray from, leave that at auto. Scan from preview should be unchecked. Preview resolution should be auto. Preview resolution, what that is it's going to do a low resolution preview scan just to show on the screen so that you can make your adjustments for cropping and the other settings for it. If you leave it at auto, Vuescan will detect how big your screen is and make an appropriate size scan to work with it. Scan resolution, this is an important one. This needs to be at the maximum resolution your scanner is capable of. For my scanner, it's 4000 dpi. Most of the later Nikon scanners, like the Coolscan V and the Coolscan 5000 and the 8000 ED and the 9000, those were all 4000 dpi scanners. I know Minolta made a 5400, I think, dpi 35mm scanner. Canon, I think, made one that was 4000. Whatever it is that your scanner is capable of scanning at, choose that as your scan resolution. I know there's people who will say, well, I don't need such a high resolution scan, because a 4000 dpi scan of a 35mm negative will let you make like a 12 by 15 or 12 by 16 inch print, something like that. It makes a pretty large size file. And I know people will say, well, I don't need that much resolution because all I'm going to do is I'm going to print some 4x6s or some 5x7s or whatever. Trust me, if you do that, and this was a mistake I made over 20 years ago when I first started scanning. I scanned some negatives thinking I was just going to print some 8x10s of them. Well, guess what? I showed them to somebody who said, I'd love to buy a print of that. Can I get a 16x20? Oh crap, now I got to redo the scan again because the smaller scan that I made didn't have enough resolution. So I ended up having to rescan the negative and redo all of the Photoshop work that I had done as far as adjusting the tonality, all the retouching, anything that I had done to it, I had to totally redo. Complete waste of time. I learned my lesson very early on that. So everything is scanned at the maximum resolution now. If somebody wants a big print, I can make a big print. If you want a smaller print, you can always make a smaller print from the high resolution file. You cannot take a low resolution file and make a big print though. It won't look good. So choose the highest scan resolution. Okay, auto flip should be unchecked. Rotation, We'll leave this alone for right now. We need to do the preview scan before we can choose the setting, and I'll show you why that is once we do it. Auto skew and mirror should be unchecked. Autofocus should be at always. Auto scan should be none. Auto save should be scan. What this means is that when it completes a scan, it will then save the file automatically. Auto print should be none. What this does is if you had this turned on, it would automatically make a print. If you had a printer connected, it would automatically send the file to the printer to print as soon as the scan was done. You don't want to do that. Scans that come out of the scanner directly are not suitable for printing yet. They need to be worked on in Photoshop or some other editor to adjust the contrast and tonality. I'll show you why that is once we do the preview scan. So you want that to be none. Auto repeat should be none. Number of passes, this should be 1. What this does is, and your scanner may not offer this as an option, so it may not show up in your version of Vuescan depending on what kind of scanner you have. But many scanners have what they call multi-pass scanning. And what that does is each line of pixels that the scanner scans, if you have this set to a higher number of passes, it will scan each line of pixels more than once. And then it averages the values it got from those scans. And it's a technique that reduces noise in the scans. It doesn't really make a difference in black and white negatives or color negatives. You won't see any difference from using multi-pass scanning because it's mostly something that shows up in images that have very, very dense film, which color slide film has much higher maximum density than any negative film does. And so the shadow areas in a color slide will often be noisy, especially if you try to lighten them up in Photoshop later. And so the multi-pass scanning, if you're scanning color slides, will reduce that tendency to have noisy shadows. And so for color slides, it's useful. For negatives, black and white or color, it's not. If you choose the multi-pass scanning, it actually increases your scan times a lot. If you choose 2 passes, it doubles your scanning time. You choose 4 passes, it quadruples your scanning time. It's worth that weight for color slides. It's not worth it for negatives. So we're just going to keep this at 1. Lock exposure. If you're doing more than one scan, if you're scanning more than one negative that was shot of the same subject under the same lighting with the same exposure, it's valuable to choose this before you scan them. And what that does is it ensures that the scanner will use the same exposure settings. Because the scanner has automatic exposure. It looks at the negative and decides how much exposure to give the scans. You want all your scans to have the same exposure if you have several of them that were shot at the same time with the same light, same subject, and whatever, in order to ensure that they will all look the same. So I'm leaving that unchecked because I'm only scanning one negative today. But if you're doing more than one that were shot, like I said, where you need uniformity, check that then. Analog gain. These are basically manual exposure settings, but they don't. They're kind of like the exposure settings on a Polaroid camera. You're still getting auto exposure, but then you can manually tell it to give more or less exposure compared to what the automatic setting was. I've never seen any reason to use them. I just leave them set at 1, which is the default. Default folder. This is where it's going to scan. This is where it's going to save your scans. So what you would do is you would click the little @ sign here, choose a folder on your computer where you want your pictures to be scanned, and hit OK, and then that's where they're going to end up after the scans are done. File name, we'll just leave this alone. Default options should be unchecked. So now that we've got these things set, let's go ahead and do let's go ahead and do the pre-scan. So we'll hit preview. You can hear the scanner doing its little buzzing and whirring, and the motor's running. So this will only take a few seconds to do the preview scan. Okay, here's our preview scan. Now we can see the scan is turned on its side. That's where rotation comes in. We'll go back up here. This says rotation left. So let's change this until we find the setting that works. So no rotation means it's upside down. So we'll do flip. There we go. Now we see the scan right side up. And you'll also see around here there's a crop box that we can adjust. And so you want to adjust that so that you don't have those white borders showing. Now it's possible for you to crop a picture much more severely if you want. If you've got a picture that you know you need to crop in on something much closer, you can do that here in Vuescan too, if you wish. But I want to scan the entire negative area. So, okay, I've got my cropping set, and then there's this other little circle that you see here. This is the autofocus point. This is where the scanner is going to focus on, because the scanner actually has an autofocus system, just like an autofocus camera, that looks at the detail in the scan, just the same way that the autofocus system in a digital camera looks at the detail in the scene you're photographing and focuses on it. So what we want to do is we want to choose something in the scene that has real fine detail that it can focus on. So we're not going to want to focus on like the sofa here because it's real smooth sort of material. You'll want to focus on something like maybe the grass or the light pole here, which has a lot of fine detail with the grain of the wood. Typically, I like to focus on something that's close to the center of the picture if possible, just in case the negative isn't totally flat. Because if it's not totally flat and you focus on something like, say, down here at the bottom, everything else may be out of focus. So I try to focus on something near the middle that has fine detail. So I'm just going to choose the grass right here. Now that we've done that, we need to go to the other tabs and see what settings we have to change. The crop tab I leave set at manual, and I just leave all the rest of this stuff alone. Filter tab, we have several different things that we can choose from here. Restore colors is something that's used for scanning color pictures that may have faded. Restore fading increases contrast for faded pictures, and restore color is supposed to make the color more accurate, because a lot of times color pictures that have faded will also have color shifts, so they won't simply fade to being lighter than they normally would, the way a black and white faded picture is. A color faded picture may shift in color as well, so that's what these things do. They're not applicable for what we're doing. Grain reduction, leave that at none. The grain reduction in Vuescan doesn't really reduce grain, it just destroys sharpness. You can try it if you want to see how it looks, but it really doesn't look good. So I leave that off. I also don't do any sharpening in Vuescan. Vuescan sharpening is kind of primitive compared to that in Photoshop or Lightroom. And I found it's not really a good idea to sharpen a scan right after it's scanned anyway, because film has grain, and when you sharpen a scan of film, it really accentuates that grain. I save my sharpening for right before I make a print. After I resize the file to the print size, then I'll sharpen the resized picture to make it look good when it's printed, but I don't do any sharpening of the full resolution scan. So now we'll go on to color. Even though we're dealing with black and white stuff, this is still called the color tab, and this is the settings that set things like how much contrast and such there is. The color balance thing, these settings don't really make any difference on a black and white picture. You can see I'm changing them to different ones, and everything's looking about the same. The only one that you'll really see any actual difference with is if you set it to none, the scan will typically get a lot darker. But pretty much all the other settings give you about the same results. So usually I just leave it set to neutral for black and white pictures. Black point and white point. Set both of those at 0. I think by default the white point one is set at like 1 or 2 or something. But I would set it at 0. And what this does is it gives you a scan that's a bit flatter in tone, but it ensures that no tones are clipped. You're not going to have any blown out highlights or blocked up shadows. So leave those at 0. The curve low and curve high, I just leave those at the default. What these are is these are kind of like doing curves adjustments in Photoshop to adjust contrast, but this is such a primitive system. We have to type in numbers like this. It doesn't work very well, and it's very hard to control. So I just leave it at the default and adjust my tonality in an image editing software like Photoshop or Lightroom after the scan. The brightness settings I leave at the defaults, which is the number 1. These are the film settings, vendor, brand, and type. So this was shot on Kodak T-Max 400 film is what I've used here. So you see a bunch of different manufacturers here. No, I think that Kodak is the only one that really has any black and white films available. Ilford only has a profile for XP2, which is their C41 process film. It's a C41 process black and white film. I don't think that there's any. Yeah, none of the Fuji settings are for black and white. Those are all color films that Fuji made. So you're really, if you're scanning black and white, Kodak is going to be the only choice you have. And so usually I choose Kodak T-Max and then T-Max 400. And I use this for almost all scans. There's not a huge amount of difference between the different films. The T-Max 100 setting will typically give you a darker scan than the T-Max 400. So you can experiment with these and see what looks better on your scans. But for the most part, I usually just use the T-Max 400 setting. They even have settings if you choose up here in brand, instead of choosing T-Max, if you choose either T-Max 100 or 400, then under the type you can actually choose developers and contrast indexes that you developed it for. So if you developed it in D76 to a contrast index of 0.55, you could choose that. Or I found that these really don't make a real great difference in the scans, even if they look a little different here. Once you edit them, I don't really think there's much of a real difference. So I usually just set the T-Max and this to T-Max 400 for any black and white film, even if it's not Kodak film. Scanner color space, I leave it default. Printer color space, doesn't matter what that's set because we're not going to be printing from Vuescan anyway. Film color space, I leave it default. This would be something that you would change if you have done a custom profile of a film, which is way beyond the scope of what we're doing here. So I would just leave that at default. Show IT8 outline, that's for calibrating scanners using an IT8 file, an IT8 scan, which is it's a piece of film that has a standard group of different colored squares on it that you can scan to calibrate a scanner with. We're not doing that either, so we leave that unchecked. Output color space. We're going to choose gray for that since we're doing black and white. Monitor color space. If you want the preview to be accurate, you want to tell Vuescan what your monitor's profile is. Vuescan doesn't pick this up automatically from the operating system, the way Photoshop and Lightroom do. So you would have to, and I'm assuming here you've calibrated your screen. If you've not, it doesn't really matter what this setting is, and you should calibrate your screen. If you haven't done so, you really need to do that if you're doing any kind of serious editing. Buy something like one of the i1 profilers or the spider devices that go on your screen and measure the actual brightness and color and contrast and adjust them to be correct. You really need to do that because otherwise any editing you do may not be accurate. When you make a print, you'll find it won't match what you see on your screen. So if your monitor is calibrated, you want to click the @ sign here and find the profile on your computer and choose that for your monitor. View color, we can leave it RGB, it doesn't really matter. Pixel colors and default options should be unchecked. We can go to the output tab now. The default folder that we chose in the input tab is replicated here in the output tab for some reason. I don't know why they felt the need to put that same control in 2 places. Whatever settings that you set back here in the input tab will be replicated up here, so you don't need to set it again. If you forgot to set it in the input tab, you can do it in the output tab. Here you get to choose what kind of a file you want this to save to. You can choose TIFF files, JPEGs, PDFs. PDFs are more for scanning documents with a flatbed scanner. So for photos, you're looking at either TIFFs or JPEGs. I would not scan to JPEGs because a JPEG uses compression that makes the file sizes smaller, but it also reduces image quality a lot if you do any heavy editing as far as adjusting contrast and such. And we're going to have to do that kind of editing to make these scans look good. You can see here in the preview that the scan is very flat looking. That's normal for a black and white. That's normal for a negative scan. You want the negative scan to be real flat like that to ensure that it has the full range of tones in the negative included without losing any light tones or dark tones. it looks bad on the screen, and it's not a file you would want to use as your finished file. I've seen a lot of people online who've scanned stuff like this and posted these pictures that are just right from the scanner on their social media or on photo forums because they claim that doing any editing in Photoshop is somehow cheating. That's crap. It's not cheating. It's what you have to do to get the quality right. The scanner is not designed to produce a perfect image out of the scanner. It's designed to produce an image that can be edited to be perfect. And so if you take these images right from the scanner that look so flat and gray and lifeless, and you insist that you have to use those because you think it's cheating to use Photoshop, you might as well sell your cameras and walk away. You're not doing it right. When I was in art school, my professor in photography had a big sign on the entrance to the darkroom at school that said, if you're not going to do it right, don't bother to start. All you're going to do is get in the way of those of your fellow students who are trying to achieve something. And he's right. So don't let people influence you saying that you need to, that you can't do any kind of editing or whatever on scans, that's somehow cheating or some other crap like that. It's not true. You have to do that to make them look good. And we'll look at that later after we do the final scan. I'll actually edit the scan so that you can see what I'm going to do to it. So you want to choose a TIFF file. Multi-page should be set to off. That's more of something for scanning documents, not for photographs. Size reduction should be set to 1. File type should be 16-bit gray. I don't know why it has you choose this again when we've already chosen 16-bit gray in our input, but it does, and you have to have it set the same in both of them. Unlike the default folder, the bit depth setting does not transfer from the input tab to the output tab automatically, so you're going to have to set that yourself. Compression should be off. Printed size should be set to scan size. Magnification should be 100%. Those are both default settings, so that should be like that. Now, down here you can type in metadata. If you want some metadata put in your file, like a copyright notice, you can type a description of the picture, put it in the date the picture is shot, stuff like that. And this information won't be visible on the picture itself, but if you open it in Photoshop and go to the file info setting in Photoshop, then you'll be able to see this data in there. Usually I just put this information in later when I'm editing the pictures in Photoshop, because Photoshop has a lot more comprehensive metadata controls than Vuescan does. So I just leave this stuff alone, but you can use it if you wish to. Log file, leave it on. Maximum size for the log file, I think 2 is the default, and I just leave it at that. Default options should be unchecked. The last tab over here is preferences. I don't mess with any of this stuff. I just leave them with the defaults. You don't really need to mess with any of this stuff. So let's go back to the input tab. We've already done our pre-scan. We've already set our cropping. We've already chosen our scanning settings in the color tab. Now it's time to do the final scan. So we'll hit scan here. And you hear the scanner doing its thing now. It's moving the negative into position, focusing, all that. This will take a couple minutes to do, so I'm not going to make you sit through the entire scanning process before we go into Photoshop. So I'll go ahead and end this here, and we'll skip into doing the editing in Photoshop. Okay, the scan is now completed, and we can see it looks a lot like the previous scan did. It's very flat, real gray looking. Doesn't have any dark blacks, doesn't have any real bright whites. The previous scan looks kind of grainy. It actually won't look like this, I don't think, in Photoshop. The scans that they show in Vuescan, for some reason, its preview function tends to look real grainy. So let's go ahead and go into Photoshop and look at the file there, and we can see how this looks a lot less grainy now in the sky. That grain we saw in Vuescan is gone. So what we're going to do is we're going to use curves adjustment layers to adjust the contrast. And if you don't know how to use curves or don't know how to use adjustment layers, I have separate tutorials, both written versions and videos, for those on my website, crawfordphotoschool.com, and in my YouTube channel. So the basics for those of you who aren't familiar with adjustment layers is adjustment layers let you do editing without actually altering the original image. It's non-destructive editing. So by doing the adjustments or doing any adjustments on adjustment layers, if you mess something up, you can just delete the adjustment layer and you haven't affected the original image. So to do an adjustment layer, you find the little control down here in the layers palette that looks like a circle that's half white and half black. Click that, and we'll go up here and choose curves. And then you have the curves control here. And I'll place a point right in the center of the curve. And then pull down the shadows, pull down the midtone some, go up with the highlights. Sometimes it takes more than one curves adjustment layer stacked on top of each other to get the full amount of contrast expansion that we need, because like I said, these are very flat, but that's fine. We can do the adjustments here in Photoshop, make them look good. Now we're getting closer to a nice tonality for this. We see we've got this house here is white, so we're seeing it's looking more like a white house. So white sign here. The sofa was very light colored, kind of a cream colored leather, so it needs to be kind of light too. The grass should be a mid-tone or maybe slightly darker than mid-tone. The sky could probably be a little bit lighter because it was kind of a overcast, whitish sort of sky. We want to be careful going up too high though, because we don't want to lose detail in our sofa or the White House. I think that actually looks pretty decent the way it is. It's magnified up here and see. Yeah, the tonality of this looks pretty good. I think we'll just leave this the way it is. See, you got a little dust spot there. You should always try to clean your negatives as well as possible before you scan them, but you're always going to have a few dust spots on a black and white negative. It's almost impossible to keep them totally dust free. Yeah. Might be able to go a little bit higher with the highlights. Let's try that and see. I don't want the contrast to get too harsh though. Especially in our darker tones. I don't want to lose too much detail in our darker tones, so. Quick lesson on the curves things. The curves is this line represents the tones in the picture. The lower parts of the curve represent your dark tones. The middle of the curve represents your midtones, and the higher parts of the curve represent your highlight tones. So by adjusting just part of the curve, you can affect, like here we can affect just the highlights. See how the light tones are getting lighter, but it's not really affecting anything else. Or we can adjust the dark tones here. See how the dark tones get darker without affecting the light tones much. Or the midtones can be adjusted up and down. I think this is a little too harsh looking though, too much contrast. Let's pull these highlights down a little. Yeah, I guess I do like this a little bit better. It's a little stronger than it was before. Might bring up the shadows just slightly. Maybe bring these down just a little too. Make it a little bit less harsh, but yeah, kind of a subtle difference, but I like a little bit of added punchiness. The sign said yard sale. They had a yard sale the day before I took this picture. And the sofa was something that they decided to put out for the trash. It's my neighbor's house. Yeah, I think this looks great. So that's the work you have to do to get a good scan. Now, I've had people ask me, is there like a standard set of curves you can give me that'll make my scans look perfect? Unfortunately, no. Every image is going to have to be edited individually. You could take these 3 sets of curves adjustment layers here, stick them on another film scan, and the picture may look absolutely horrible. It may look way too dark or too light, or the contrast may be way off. It just depends on the individual image. So I can't give you an easy way out on this. You're going to have to do the editing in Photoshop for each individual one, and it can be kind of a learning curve when you're getting started. But if you're once you've done a few of them, it starts to become something you can do pretty quickly, like I just did. But that is something you have to do with the negative scans. You can't take the negative right out of the scanner. Like I said, it always looks terrible, and so you have to do this editing to get the tonality right where you want it to be. So once we got this done, we can save the picture and we're finished with it.